Welcome to Crossroad Connection. We're speaking out for those left unheard. My name is Art Van Walde, and for the next 2 weeks we're going to give you a little insight on the usage of solitary confinement and the effects on those who experience it. We'll be showing footage from a recent continuing education seminar held here at CBI. Today, you'll hear from Lois DeMont from the Family Participation Program and Citizens for Prison Reform, and Dr. Barry Mintzes, a licensed psychologist and former warden.
So I'm going to share with you this evening what has led me to do the work that I'm doing currently. I'm going to be sharing a little bit of my backstory, but also of other families and those that we've met inside. And I'm going to be focusing on specifically those who wind up in long-term segregation or solitary confinement who have mental illness. So my journey began with my son. As you can see, he had a lot of opportunities growing up. Often we have the mindset that those who wind up in the system are all living in poverty, or they're living in drug houses or on the streets. And I'm here to tell you that that's not always the case, that each family has their own personal story and background. So when my son was very young, at the age of 3 and 4, we began seeing that he had emotional impairments. And we began seeking treatment when he was that very young age, seeking psychological evaluations and therapy. And by the time that he was 11 years old, he had tried living out of home in a new environment with family to see if that was the answer, and it didn't fix things. He ended up having an inpatient psychiatric stay. He was diagnosed as bipolar at the age of 11. He wound up in 2 out-of-state residential treatment facilities, and he also wound up with his first detention facility stay. Community mental health in our community said we needed to start calling the police to get the help that he needed, that the court system had the funding. And as parents, you often don't know what to do. You don't know what the answers are, so that's what we started doing. Little did we know how quickly he would become enmeshed in the system. When he was 13 years old, he was manic, and he owed some people money. They drove him down to a Little Caesars pizza store, and he went in with a toy gun. He got scared, he left, he didn't take any money, but he was charged in that county, given a blended sentence. He was charged as an adult. And what that meant was the judge was giving him one last chance or opportunity to make it in a program. And if he didn't make it, then he would be sentenced into the Michigan Department of Corrections. So at 13, they sent him on to Iowa to a program, and once he was in that program and we received their literature, it said right on the front that they didn't take youth who were bipolar. He made it there for 7 months before he had these rages again that had been occurring since he was very young, and they sent him back into Michigan. And this photo here you'll see was taken the day that he was sentenced into the Michigan Department of Corrections. The Battle Creek Enquirer was there. His case was widely published at the age of 13. They released his name. Everything was out in the papers. So at the age of 15, he was 15 by 2 months. He was sentenced into the Michigan Department of Corrections. You can see in this photo he's wearing a Bam Bam suit. And that's because he had was trying to slit his wrists with spoons, and he had spent 2 weeks in solitary there at the jail. The judge told us that day that he would receive the mental health helps that he needed inside the system. And we believed that because we didn't know any different. How often is it now on the news, have you heard, you've heard that the judge is ordering that someone that they're sending into prison, that they're ordering that they be given mental health treatment. And that's just not how the system works. So once he was inside the system, we learned quickly that the mental health help that he needed was not there and available. He was sentenced to Lapeer, where all of the youth must go. The problem is that in that facility, they have no inpatient psychiatric prison. So if they need significant mental health help, then they have to put them in with the adult prisoners in the adult psychiatric prison. And that was where he wound up 7 months after he went into the prison system. His minimum sentence was 5 months into the Michigan Department of Corrections with a maximum of 5 years. He ended up doing 5 years because of his mental health. Once he was moved over into the adult psychiatric prison, there he started seeing other youth. And the letter on the left is from a young man who was just 14 years old, yet his mentality was stated that of a 6-year-old. And my son was begging me to help and assist these other youth because he knew that they were in a lot worse shape than he was. They didn't have any outside supports or family that knew what to do or how to help them. The young man on the letter on the right is from a 16-year-old who wrote, and he knew something wasn't right. He was in the mental health treatment program, yet he was staying in his cell all of the time, sometimes getting just 1 hour out during the day in a caged yard. And that was because of his age, because they were working to try and keep him safe, yet he wasn't getting the mental health treatment that he was there for. And here's yet another young man that we helped, and this is just a year before his sentence, and you can see just how young he looks. So yes, in Michigan, we do sentence juveniles into our adult prisons. Often people don't know that and aren't aware of that. So I started advocating and reaching out. My son actually said to me, you need to Google, we've heard that there's groups out there, and that was when I found American Friends Service Committee, Natalie, and they informed me of a rally that was going to be occurring the next day in Lansing. So I came to Lansing that following day, and there I learned and met the mother of Timothy Souders, and I learned about his story. And you can see the photographs here of Timothy and also Jeffrey Clark, both of who lost their lives in solitary, and both who had severe mental illness. So Timothy Souders' story was on 60 Minutes. You can Google it and still watch that. And Timothy was restrained for a total of 72 hours and died of dehydration. There were 36 employees who walked in and out of his cell, and only one of them lost their job when his whole case was over. Jeffrey Clark was schizophrenic, and he also died of dehydration because his water had been shut off. And then in the upper right-hand photograph, you'll see the photo of Mr. McManus, and he died of starvation in the Upper Peninsula in a prison. Again, he quit eating, he was mentally ill, and these photographs were taken inside the prison and gotten from prison records through Freedom of Information Act. I share these stories with you because I was so shocked to learn this. You know, I used to think you do the crime, you do the time. That was my mindset. I was a transcriptionist when my son went into prison. I had no clue what was going on inside the prison system, and I had no idea. I simply thought that we were safer out here because all of these people were locked up. And so it really was a turning point for me, and it has become my driving force and my passion now to assist families and prisoners. And what I feared most happened next. My son was sent into long-term segregation. He continued to deteriorate. He would have well periods off and on. But the photograph in the right lower corner is a photo that I got out of my son after he had been in Ionia in maximum security there for, he had been there for 3 months. At that point, he'd lost 25 pounds. And this was the treatment that he received for banging his head on his wall. So he was going crazy, banging his head on the wall. He was off from his medication. I will show you in a later slide that one of the issues is they're not able to give them medication as needed once they go into segregation or solitary. They can only do that at the inpatient psychiatric prison. And then I met another family, parents of Charlie Lane, and Charlie's story, I think, is really significant because he fought in the Gulf War. He's a veteran. He served our country. So Charlie was discharged from the military. He was diagnosed with mental illness at that time, but they discharged him. He wound up back in Michigan, committed crimes, went into the prison system. And when his parents started talking with me, they shared that he was in the mental health treatment program, but he ended up biting off 2 fingers, picking out his own eye, and they got a call that he was in a coma and that he was going to die. They got him to an outside hospital, and there the doctors looked at his records and recognized that he was on Haldol, which was in his records that he was allergic to. So they got him off the Haldol. He began to get better. And Charlie is living out in the southern part of Michigan today. I do want to point out to you that this is not what happens to everyone in solitary. This is not the case with everyone. But I do really have grave concerns with the mental health care that occurs once they're inside solitary. And often, many of those with significant mental illness do wind up in solitary because they're not able to conform to the Michigan Department of Corrections standards. So all of this work basically led us to doing letter writing campaigns and had no vision or plan or idea of beginning an organization. The first letter writing campaign was around the juveniles that we saw in the system. And the second one was around the treatment of those in solitary confinement, particularly those with mental illness. And we started doing legislative work. So in 2011, we formed Citizens for Prison Reform. So in 2010, the University of Michigan did a study, and they found that more than 20% of the state prisoners, about 10,000 inmates out of a population of 45, had severe mental disabilities. And the same study found that 65% of the 10,000 with severe mental disabilities had received no treatment in the previous 12 months. Currently, within the system, there's only one recipient rights specialist for all of the mentally ill. He has to travel to the UP and all over Michigan to go to all those prisons where there are prisoners with mental illness that have been diagnosed. Many prisoners with mental illness are unable to conform to the department's rules, so they often wind up in long-term segregation. Mentally ill prisoners who are outside of the inpatient psychiatric prison cannot receive medication on an as-needed basis. So if they need something to help calm them down, that's not possible for them to get that in segregation. Placement in segregation often leads to further deterioration of their mental health and increased acting out. Security management may then involve the use of restrictions, which can include water, electricity, paper, there's other restrictions, and then the use of restraints, chemicals, and hog tying. Mentally ill prisoners often have new felonies that they wind up being charged with once they are in the system, whether they're in solitary or not. But this is something that we see over and over again with many of them. So in 2012, Michigan made the news, and it says many of these prisoners end up among the 1,000 or so held in administrative segregation. MDOC administrators acknowledge that the percentage of prisoners with mental illness in segregation is probably higher than in the overall population. So what I really saw was how alone and walled off families were and how difficult it was to get the information that they needed. And even more so, we saw this in the mental health units. We saw how there were a lot fewer families who actually came to visit once our son was in the mental health units. And then on top of that, once you're in segregation, you know, phone privileges are taken away. The visits are shorter, behind glass, usually with a phone. And so the visits become more cumbersome. It also creates more problems with support, finding support for the prisoners who are in solitary. And out of all of that work, I ended up deciding to apply for a Soros Fellowship and received that in May of 2014, and have now started the Family Participation Program to assist families in navigating through and teaching them how to become best advocates. I do have pilot prisons where posters are available, and those are available to the prisoners and to families. We have about 4 families that we have assisted in getting guardianship over their loved ones who have wound up in these circumstances, who have cognitive impairments, such mental illness that they need to really have a guardian, and the court has ordered that. So we're utilizing some of those skills to kind of really push in on the department so that some of these people who wind up with no visits, who wind up not being able to have someone there present those guardians are able to get in and go to their treatment team meetings. They're able to have visits when normally they wouldn't be allowed. So we're kind of doing some of those pieces, educating families on how they can stay more involved.
Correcting Bible study lessons is crucial to helping inmates. To partner with CBI in this safe and secure role, please visit us at cbi.fm on the web.
When a judge sentences somebody, they sentence them to the Department of Corrections, and from there they're classified to what facility they should basically be held at. Basically, there are two criteria for which prison a person is sent to, unless that's changed, I don't know, but that's the way it was when I worked there. They would use two criteria. One is the length of the sentence, two is the person's age, and whether the person is a management problem at the county jail. Those are the only two criteria. Has nothing to do with mental illness, has nothing to do with the nature of the offense. That has to do with the kind of how long their sentence is and whether or not they constituted a management problem at the county jail. Those are the two criteria. So if somebody's committed a murder, for example, and the judge only gives them a 2-year minimum, they'll go to a lower security facility. So that's important that the judges understand. But when the judge sentences somebody, they sentence the person to the Department of Corrections, regardless of what they say in their sentencing transcript. I can remember even a judge in a sentencing transcript sentenced to somebody to life imprisonment on the hard rock pile in solitary confinement. This was in a sentencing transcript. And I wrote a letter back to the judge, said, first of all, we don't have a hard rock pile, so forget about that part. Secondly, we can't put him in solitary confinement for the rest of his life because at least at that point in time, I don't know if this is still true, but there's a security classification committee that has to review all the inmates that are in solitary confinement, and they do that every 2 weeks. So you can't just lock somebody up and throw the key away. Also, when a person is in solitary confinement, they have hardly any privileges at all, and they have a need for human contact. And basically, when the officer comes around and gives the food, that's basically the only human contact that they have. Many times, one of the things that I know that they've done, in addition to the food slot where the person is back up to the cell, they also have a slot on the bottom, and the person's put in leg irons. So they come out of their cell, they're in handcuffs and leg irons. And then there's they don't call it a leash, I call it a leash. Is a leash attached to them so they can't get very far. And there's usually 2 officers for each person. So if they have to go out someplace, they don't get very far. One of the things that happens when somebody's locked up all the time, basically 23 hours a day, they start to develop kind of their own fantasy world because they have something to entertain you. So you make up things to entertain you, and it's that fantasy world becomes real important now for people who are paranoid to start with. And don't forget, they're in an environment where being paranoid is somewhat adaptable, because there are people that are out to get you. Mainly, most of the prison population is out to get you. So, but if you're paranoid and you're out on the streets, you could do things to protect yourself. You can arm yourself. You could become seclusive. You could not go out in public. But when you're locked up in solitary confinement, you can't. There's no way that you can get away from the voices inside your head. So if you're paranoid, it just makes matters that much worse. So in an environment where being somewhat paranoid is adaptable, when you're in solitary confinement, the mental illness that you have just gets worse. because you have no place to hide. One of the things that happens when people are in segregation or in solitary confinement, and I realize there are a lot of different levels of segregation, but when I talk about most segregation is solitary confinement, where people have very limited privileges. Because there's a need for human contact, and because they really have nobody to talk to, unless you have your own way of adapting to it, it exacerbates mental illness, and you become mentally ill as a function of being in that kind of environment where you're basically locked up for 23 hours a day, and even the 1 hour a day that you might go out to yard. Most of these places they have, like behind the segregation cell, they have like a little cage where people, I consider them equivalent to dog runs in a kennel where, when you let the dog out to go to the bathroom, you let the dog go into this little run in the back, so there's no place for them to go except in this little cage they have. They still have no contact with others. As a psychologist, it is clearly cruel and unusual punishment to put somebody in solitary confinement. As a prison administrator, aside from the fact that, I don't like the idea of solitary confinement, then you run into the issue of, what do you do with these people? Where do you put them? Because, a lot of these people, not all of them, but a lot of them are very nasty people. When I was on Security Classification Committee at Jackson, when we released somebody to the general prison population, if it was a particularly notorious inmate, yet once we released them to general population, several people would lock themselves up for protection because they didn't want to be around this person because they were afraid of him. So they would lock up for protection. It was better for them to go into solitary confinement than to be at large in the general prison population. Whereas I'd say most of the inmates are armed, not so much to take staff hostage or to get released, but to protect themselves from other inmates, because that's the kind of environment that you have. Now, several bodies have considered solitary confinement to be cruel and unusual punishment, akin to torture. Now, the issues that have been mentioned before with regard to the numbers of mentally ill, that's pretty accurate, as is the number of this disproportionate number of African Americans in our system. I know when I was at Jackson, probably I think it was about 60% African American. At least that's changed a little bit. There's always been a disproportionate number of African Americans. The people who work in the Department of Corrections, they eventually establish kind of a siege mentality because they're always getting sued, and the department is always on their case about something. So when somebody does something wrong, they tend to treat everybody similarly, and they trust nobody. As they start to develop a siege mentality, and you're always under pressure. I remember when I was at Jackson, and I was applying for a loan, and I had one secretary that did nothing but keep track of the litigation. That was her full-time job because we had so much litigation. She always knew exactly where I stood. And I remember the loan officer said, there's a little box on most loan applications that says, do you have any lawsuits against you? And I was checked, yes. And she said, how many do you have? Because she knew what I did. I said, 283. She said, 283.
Pending at one time?
What, yeah.
Pending at one time?
Pending at one time. And said, are they for any money? I said, oh yeah. He said, well, do the inmates ever win them? I said, oh yeah. He said, well, how much are they asking for? I said, how much in total? Are the damages that they're requesting against me? He said, yeah. I said, $6 billion. He says, well, when the inmates win, do you have to pay those? I said, no, you do. She didn't like that at all. But now, don't forget, she had to ask these questions because I was applying for a loan. So she had to know if I was on the hook for $6 billion. But anyway, it's, I think the lack of mental health in most institutions is really clear. And part of the problem is that the legislature is very reluctant to provide additional money for the Department of Corrections. Even right now, I remember one of my patients was working in the housing unit at one of the institutions. And don't forget, you have like one officer for about 180 inmates, all of whom are free, because they're on bunks, they're not in cells. There's one officer on each side, and each side has roughly 180 inmates. And then there's one officer that roams between the two of them. And he said, if we just had one more officer per housing unit, that would be fine. And which is not an unreasonable request by any means. The problem is that, if you have 5 housing units and you add one officer, so 5 officers for 3 shifts is 15, plus with time off and vacations, you end up having to hire 27 people. And that's just housing. That just doesn't mention custody of the people who work the gates and the yard, plus food service and all the clerical staff and all the administrative staff. So if each institution needs 100 people, and you multiply it by 43 institutions, then we're talking about 4,300 positions. And that's just one bureau. That's the Bureau of Correctional Facilities. Then, for all the different bureaus, the Bureau of Field Services that needs more parole and probation officers, and all the other bureaus that are involved. And you're already talking about a department where one out of every 4 civil servants in the state of Michigan works for the Department of Corrections. So, a legislator is not going to look very kindly at that request. If he's got 19 state agencies that he's going to deal with. So it seems like a minor request, ends up being a major issue. So whereas an institution may say, well, we need 100 new positions, and what'll happen is, when the budget finally comes down to the institution, they say, well, you're authorized 4 new positions. So then the warden has to decide, where those 4 positions will go, and the warden is going to be concerned about, not only mental health issues, but the custody and security of the institution. So there's a lot of issues. It's a very complicated process.
Thanks for joining us for this special edition of Crossroad Connection. Don't miss Part 2, where you'll hear from Natalie Holbrook and Peter Martell from the American Friends Service Committee's Michigan Criminal Justice Program. And if you're interested in attending upcoming seminars, check out our website at cbi.tv to find out more and sign up. We hope to see you again right here next week.